It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. And I thought it might be fun to do a bunch of movies that I've already done before. Won't that be fun for you as listeners to hear? A retread of things I've already talked about? Hey, wait a minute. Hang on a second here. I think I might have messed up the opening to this. Let me redo it. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. Now, I thought it might be fun to cover remakes of movies that I've already covered on this show before. I feel like, for the most part, the 5 I've selected for the Monster Mondays during November of 2021 each represent something slightly different than the movies the originals were. Now, on top of that, I also tried to pick enough remakes of movies that I've not thought about or talked about in a while. All in all, we're going to actually retread mostly titles. Now, I'm not going to bog these episodes down with a bunch of comparison to the original movie that they are being remade from either. As I said, a lot of the originals haven't been seen terribly recently. Plus, I picked these movies as original reimaginings of those originals so that they are different and interesting on their own standing, absent of the originals. Now, there may be one exception coming up later in the month, but we'll see about that when we get there. Now, first up, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor. Yep, it's the Blob. 30 years after the original starring Steve McQueen oozed into theaters and into history as a sci-fi horror classic, director Chuck Russell, hot off of making possibly and probably my favorite of the Freddy movies, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, co-wrote a $10 million 80s treatment with Frank Derebot. Now, while the movie didn't succeed with audiences and was on shaky grounds with critics at the time, it has since gained a huge cult following. Now, Russell, who would later go on to make one of the top-grossing movies of 1994, The Mask with Jim Carrey, said in an interview that maybe it wasn't the best idea to remake The Blob with a sense of humor. That's one of the things that I think gets appreciation for in the present. It's cheeky, and I'm sure that I'll have more to say about some of the cleverness as we kind of continue along this episode. But it also didn't help that the movie was released in August of 1988. That summer movie slate included movies such as Friday the 13th Part 7 and Willow in May. While neither were huge hits themselves, they had a lot of publicity and recognition. The big hit of the early summer was Rambo 3, quickly followed by Big, The Presidio, Red Heat, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Coming to America, all occupying theaters in June. July brought The Deadpool, a re-release of Bambi, A Fish Called Wanda, Midnight Run, Cocktail, and Die Hard. Then in August, just 2 weeks after The Blob's release, the 4th Nightmare on Elm Street movie hit. So it was a busy summer. Now, there are even more recognizable movies that came out that summer that I didn't mention. This was the late 80s, age of the summer blockbuster that spelled doom for risky reimaginings of classic horror like this movie. Now, Chuck Russell did have an interesting career. He co-wrote the 1984 sci-fi film Dreamscape. With that 3rd Nightmare on Elm Street movie that I mentioned, New Line wasn't so sure about the future of that franchise. The second film in the series flopped badly and would need about 30 more years to find a die-hard audience for it. But they gave Russell a shot when he talked about how he could expand on Freddy's nightmare world through cutting-edge special effects and create compelling characters to fill out the victims roster. And when that hit theaters, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors became the highest-grossing independent film in history. Now, that gave him the chance to sell his new idea for The Blob, which would also stretch a budget with some really great effects. After The Blob, he didn't go back to directing until The Mask in 1994, which destroyed the box office with $350 million worldwide against an $18 million budget. Jim Carrey and Cameron Diaz became superstars, and the FX team got nominated for an Oscar for how well it blended live action with cartoony effects. He was able to roll that into making the Schwarzenegger action flick Eraser a couple of years later. That made a bunch of money at the international box office. And then The Scorpion King, which started Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on the path to film superstardom. Currently, Russell is in pre-production for a reimagining of the 1986 indie horror classic Witchboard, so he's not done yet. Co-writer Frank Derebot, well, he's a heavy hitter in the world of several different genres. He was partnered up with Russell on several instances, including Nightmare on Elm Street 3, as well as both being producers on the Michael Mann crime thriller Collateral, starring Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. He worked as a script doctor on Eraser, as well as the 2014 Godzilla movie. He's been nominated twice for writing Oscars for adapting the Stephen King stories into The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. Now, he's not just a movie guy either. Derebot did a couple of episodes of Tales from the Crypt and several episodes of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Of course, he developed the mega hit The Walking Dead into a smash cable TV show and did some really solid work for a couple of seasons until he was fired by AMC when AMC wanted to do a reduced budget but make more episodes on that said reduced budget, which didn't really go over too well with Derebot. But there can be arguments over what that did to the series as a whole, but not here. Why? Because it's time to talk about The Blob. The movie opens on what appears to be a totally deserted town. Has the Blob already come and killed everyone? Will this be told in flashback? Nope. The residents of Arborville, California aren't missing or dead. They are at the high school football game. And we see this as the camera focuses on a graveyard, then cleverly pans over to see that it is right next door to the football field. And we meet our leads of the movie. Star football player Jock Paul, who is played by Donovan Leitch. The cute lead cheerleader Meg, played by Shawnee Smith. And a rebel with a motorcycle, Brian, played by Kevin Dillon. Brian fails to jump a broken bridge and sees a bum collecting cans to recycle for money and the bum's dog. Now, considering the era and the position of the dog in center frame, you got to count on something bad happening to that dog. But I digress. Two more characters of note are Sheriff Geller, played by Frank Darabont regular Jeffrey DeMunn, and Fran, played by Candy Clark of American Graffiti fame. Basically, we get to see the workings and characters of this sleepy, I assume, Northern California town. That all changes with that homeless guy when he witnesses a metallic ball crashing from the night sky. What's in the sphere is a goopy goo that latches onto his arm, and when he is seen by Brian, he's trying to cut off his own hand. They run into the road, and the old man gets hit by Paul's car as he and Meg are on their way to their first date. The three kids take the old man to the hospital. Now, after getting him checked in, Brian leaves, but later Paul goes to check up on the old man, but see that the old man's body is being digested by the goop that was originally on his hand. But it looks like it's begun to eat him from the waist down. Now, the old man is an acidic mess. Paul goes to call the sheriff, but is attacked by the blob dropping down on him from the ceiling. Meg, hearing Paul scream, runs to see what's going on, only to see him enveloped by the blob and melting him away. Naturally, after hearing Paul say Brian's name on the phone, Sheriff Geller wants Brian arrested in connection with the death of the star football player. Elsewhere, Scott, who's Paul's sleazy friend, is on a makeout date with his current squeeze, or at least the squeeze of that day, but she ends up getting eaten by the blob when he goes to get into his trunk to get her some more alcohol to kind of take advantage of her, unfortunately. But Thankfully, we don't have to deal with the sleazy friend for very long, as Paul is soon gobbled up by the Blob. Now, Meg is frustrated that no one believes her story about the creature that killed Paul. Brian is getting hassled by the man. But once he's released because they don't really have anything to hold him on, Meg tries to chase down Brian to tell him what she saw. When he initially rejects her because he believes that she thinks she's too good for his type, she calls him out and says that he's full of shit, like everyone else in town. And that immediately gives him pause and brings her back to the table at the diner that they've met up at to hear her out. Now, at the diner, the Blob makes its way in through the kitchen pipes and grabs a guy and pulls him down through the drain. Meg and Brian barricade themselves in the walk-in freezer, and the Blob begins to ooze under the door but stops and retreats when it touches the cold. Meanwhile, Fran is attacked by the Blob while in a phone booth trying to call Sheriff Geller, who is also being digested within the Blob too. Brian and Meg escape the diner and the Blob, but arriving later, Reverend Meeker sees the Blob go into the sewer and finds purple ice crystals in the freezer from when the Blob tried to get in and eat the kids. This sends Reverend Meeker down an entirely different path than the rest of the characters. Meg and Brian go looking for the deputy when they can't find the sheriff, and what they find instead is a government group looking for germs. This team is led by Dr. Meadows, and he explains that what they've seen and what they are looking for was a microbe that came from outer space. It's likely similar to what killed the dinosaurs. Meanwhile, at the movie theater where Meg's little brother Kevin and his friend are watching the most recent slasher flick, the projectionist starts getting hot as if the air conditioner isn't on, and he looks in the vent and finds out that the Blob is blocking the air. He gets eaten, and it eats the theater manager, who comes up to check on him as well. Back in the woods outside of town, Meg and Brian are hauled off by the government guys. Brian escapes, but Meg is taken to town and brought to a quarantine zone. While Meg tries to find her little brother, the Blob attacks the audience at the theater. It begins swiping down at people and picking them up with its tendrils. She finds people half digested on the floor, and it's just all a very gross scene. She is able to save her brother and his friend, and they escape into the sewer. And it tries to grab Meg by the hair, but the acidic goop only burns her hair and allows her to escape. Now, in the woods, Brian is trying to get out of there with his motorcycle, but overhears the government guys talking about the true origin of the Blob. It was from our own satellite with our own technology in place to create this biological weapon. Brian hears that they know it went to the sewer to chase Meg and Kevin's friend, and Dr. Meadows says that civilians are expendable in favor of capturing the creature. And speaking of the sewer, Meg and the kids get away, but they are soon to be chased underwater by the Blob. But the kids, one of which, Kevin's friend, gets nabbed and eaten by the Blob, but Kevin is able to fit through the grating to come out onto the street. However, Meg needs help from Brian to get out. But Dr. Meadows closes the manhole cover when he sees that Brian and Meg are coming up towards the ladder. Brian uses a bazooka carried by one of the soldiers who went to the sewer to find the Blob to blow the cover off and get out of there with Meg. Now, Brian tells the deputy and the rest of the town about what he learned about the Blob. Meadows tries to tell the town that Brian and Meg are infected and should be killed. While that goes on, the Blob is reaching out for Meadows and pulls him into the sewer. No longer really kind of being having to deal with Meadows wanting to keep the creature alive, the army tries to shoot and blow up the Blob, but, well, it doesn't really work at all. All it does is make the Blob angry and stronger. When it sets Reverend Meeker on fire, Meg uses a fire extinguisher on him and then on the Blob as it begins to turn towards her. She then realizes that the creature can't stand the cold. So Brian decides to haul ass and go get a snowmaking truck for the local ski resort, while Meg and the rest of the town try to barricade themselves in City Hall. Brian makes the blob mad, but he's able to hurt it with the fake snow that he's blowing on from the truck. When it knocks the truck over and starts to attack Brian, Meg, in order to save Brian from the angry blob, decides to grab some charges from a soldier to blow up the tank with the liquid nitrogen, creating the snow. The liquid nitrogen then freezes the blob into a pile of crystals, much like what the Reverend found in the freezer earlier. They decide as a town to store the remains in the ice house of the town until the military can come and dispose of it properly. But later, we see that the Reverend, who has been completely broken by seeing the blob earlier and mistaking it as a sign of the end times, is preaching at a revival, and his crystals that he took previously is now thawed out into a little baby blob. He tells the woman attending that he's waiting for the sign from God to begin the end times. Now let's get to the three things that I like about the 1988 Chuck Russell version of The Blob. First up, I really like the cast of this movie. They are written to feel pretty real and to kind of act and react like real people. Plus, we're introduced to a jock football player hot for the lead cheerleader who is, at the start, we understand, is supposedly dating someone else. Having seen movies before, we usually should finger this guy to be a jerk. But he isn't, actually. He's actually a pretty decent and good dude. He's got a friend, Scott, who is a bit sleazy, but gets his comeuppance doing a sleazy thing. Shawnee Smith's Meg is the classic girl next door, but she's a bit of an ass kicker later on in the movie when she has to help not only save her brother and his friend, but to help destroy the blob. She's almost like your perfect girl who can kind of do it all and be appealing without having to be put in skimpy clothing. Then you have Brian Flagg in the form of Kevin Dillon. Now, you think that he's a bad kid. Sheriff Geller says as much, but he's not really. He's just kind of been one of those kind of kids that kind of falls through the cracks. He operates outside the social network that this little town operates on. That doesn't make him a bad guy. He immediately wants to help the homeless guy when he sees the old guy in trouble. It's only when he comes across Paul and Meg that he gets a little cagey with them. All in all, he's a good guy and is kind to the old man and legitimately wants to help fight the blob later when he realizes that there's something fishy going on with this creature. Now, the second thing that I'll call out is the pacing of this movie. It really cooks. Before I even knew it, I was halfway through the movie. The movie isn't just fast moving, but it's also kind of smart. The light-hearted nature of the movie isn't overbearing, but consistent with the attitude a lot of 80s movies had, even when they were a little bit more serious pictures. It builds things to the point where the kids, Brian and Meg, are naturally left to try to convince the adults and the authority to figure out a way to defeat the creature, and they kind of take things into their own hands. It doesn't really go for cheap scares either. It's a well-crafted monster movie with a pretty good set of circumstances and lead characters actually being intelligent in how they handle the creature and fighting it off. Now, my third like has to be the practical effects. This movie was made on a scant $10 million budget. However, it's a masterclass in practical monster effects. The blob itself is good, but that was good in the original too. Here, we get to see people being melted away by the creature's digestive acid. We've got people hollowed out and caved in. We have people swallowed up whole. We have a guy pulled into the sink and the blob shoots out of said sink to chase Brian and Meg. There's a guy plastered to the ceiling while being digested. It's got people being bent in half and crushed. It's got the Candy Clark character gets attacked inside that phone booth, and it comes pouring in like it's being flooded in. It's really good stuff, and it's all incredibly well done by updating the monster in this remake and make it something that would really hold 1988 audiences' attention. In addition, this movie takes a really different tone than the original. A threat from outer space is fine and all, but since Alien, about 9 years before this, it's been done to death by the late 80s. So instead, there's something more insidious about this version. This was created by U.S. scientists. It becomes a conspiracy theory movie, and what crashed isn't an alien craft, but a U.S. satellite that was incubating the organism that becomes the Blob, with the plan to unleash it on an enemy. It fits with the escalating Cold War of the era and some growing concern that maybe we were doing bad things in the interest of just simply keeping ahead of the Russians. It's a good way to retell this story. Oh, and remember when I said that I had a bad feeling about the old bum's dog? Well, I think he survived. At least we didn't see him get eaten. And that's honestly kind of unexpected for horror movies of the 80s. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and Spotify. Why not hop on over to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and follow us there by just searching for Film Seizure and stay up to date with all of our releases. And while you're at it, you can head over to my website, www.bmovieanima.com, and read new text articles each and every Friday. And you can also follow B Movie Anima on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B Movie Anima. Hey, and while you're at it, go to YouTube and subscribe to the B Movie Anima channel, where you can find episodes of the movie hosting show that I do and see a bunch of clips that I grab and use for articles. But be sure to keep coming back through the rest of this year, because I have a huge announcement coming in the next few weeks about Monster Mondays that I don't want you to miss. So until next week, stay spooky.